No, they give you
How to use it.
how to use them, yeah.
Let's see.
Use the calculator. I literally hate that. I hate that so much.
I know.
I need to
there's-
dig up my finance calculator.
Yeah, there's one of them, I was like, oh my god, I've seen this question before and I can't remember how to do it.
The microphone
I was
is
mad at
alive.
myself, whatever. Have you been? I don't like that.
All right, it looks like the microphone is working.
That answer was not what I mean.
Yep, it is, it's working. Okay,
It's been a
so today we need to talk about corporate culture. What is culture?
way of doing
When we talk about culture, we can think of it as sort of a macro level thing or a micro level thing. So, for example, we have a culture in the United States. What are some of the things that you think of when we talk about culture in the US?
Fast food.
Fast food. Why do you say fast food?
McDonald's, Burger King.
McDonald's, like we invented basically the fast food industry in the United States. And we are probably far more committed to it than other countries are, right? And we eat out probably more than other countries do. How many people actually cook anymore? Not many. It's kind of incredible to me, all of my friends who have these wonderful kitchens in their homes that they've never actually used. They don't know how to cook because they just don't do it. We're so busy running our children to activity after activity after activity so that we don't actually have to deal with them, that we don't actually, sit down and cook a meal. When I was growing up, the vast majority of people, their moms, even if their mothers worked, they, came home and made dinner and had a meal around the table. Now it's feed your kid as you're running to soccer and lacrosse and baseball and cheernastics. That's what I call what my niece does. She gets very upset when I call it that, but it's no longer like cheerleading. When I was a kid growing up, cheerleading was, they did a few kicks and maybe a tumble or something like that, but now it's this enormously high flying, pyramid structure, jumping around it's crazy. So, her parents never cook at home. They just, run from thing to thing to thing. What else would we say is, part of the American culture? Well, it's the flag. So it involves symbols that we identify with closely. The Pledge of Allegiance. The idea that we say, even though we don't really have a democracy, we have a Republican form of government, but we say that we are a democratic nation, even though, again, the only part of our federal government that is democratic is the United States House of Representatives, in which every single member is elected by basically the same number of people. The United States Senate does not represent people, it represents states. Every state has two. There's going to be a huge election in California to determine who will be the next senator from California, as Dianne Feinstein has announced that she is not going to run for re-election. She's really, really old. It's questionable as to whether or not she actually is competent at the current time to even hold, but so we have this idea that we have a democracy, even though the third branch of government, the judiciary, is completely not elected. It's appointed for life. That doesn't sound very democratic to me when you have people who are appointed and will be on the bench for 40 years and making laws well after the person who appointed them. The president is not directly elected, but again, it's part of our culture to say we have a democracy. The president is elected by electors. When we go to the poll and vote, we're voting for actually a slate of electors. And that's predicated on the number of congressmen we have and senators. So every state has at least three. You have at least one representative and two senators from each state. So that's not terribly democratic, but we pay lip service to it. We have differences in culture from Oklahoma to, say, New York. What are some of the differences between Oklahomans and New Yorkers?
The concept of like Southern hospitality and
Okay.
being someone that, can talk to anyone versus in New York, it's more of a stay in your own lane, come together when you need to.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many people that they just don't, like, you don't look people in the eye when you're walking down the street, say hello, they're not friendly the way we are in Oklahoma. It's very much what you said. I don't think it's that New Yorkers are not caring, but when you have, millions and millions of people on a tiny island, it tends to have different results and effects than what we have here, which is everybody sort of has their own plot of land and there's lots of room to grow, and traffic is not a huge issue. I mean, Oklahoma City is one of the easiest cities in the country, I think, to get around in, because you can get almost anywhere by an interstate within 5 minutes or so, because we have this, yeah, I mean, it's just, it's really, really efficient. So there's that difference. Is culture something that is organic? Does it come from the bottom up? Or is it something that is imposed from the top down, do you suppose?
It can be both.
I think that's right. I think that it can be both. It is something that obviously is impacted by sort of the people that we hire, and also by sort of higher ups in terms of what their vision and value is. So Johnson & Johnson, until the opioid crisis and the huge settlement that they had, it was one of the most admired companies in terms of this idea of a corporate culture. They have this credo, which I think is, and they still, pay lip service to this. We believe our first responsibility is to the patients, doctors, and nurses, to mothers and fathers, and all who use our products and services. In meeting their needs, everything we do must be of high quality. We must constantly strive to provide value, reduce our costs, and maintain reasonable prices. Customers' orders must be serviced promptly and accurately. Our business partners must have an opportunity to make a fair profit. We are responsible to our employees who work with us throughout the world. We must provide an inclusive work environment. This is something like, all of a sudden we're seeing a huge backlash against this idea of inclusivity and what some people are calling the woke culture. I mean, Johnson & Johnson basically had this idea of inclusivity and what we might think of as being woke long before that term became popular. I don't even know what that really means. If you look at the Urban Dictionary, I think they've got a fairly good definition of woke. They must have a sense of security, fulfillment, and purpose in their jobs. Compensation must be fair and adequate, and working conditions clean, orderly, and safe. We must support the health and well-being of our employees and help them fulfill their family and other personal responsibilities. Employees must feel free to make suggestions and complaints. There must be equal opportunity for employment, development, and advancement for those qualified. We must provide high, capable leaders, and their actions must be just and ethical. We are responsible to the communities in which we live and work, and to the world community as well. We must help people be healthier by supporting better access and care in more places around the world. We must be good citizens, support good works and charities, better health and education, and bear our fair share of taxes. We must maintain in good order the property we are privileged to use, protecting the environment and natural resources. Our final responsibility is to our stockholders. Businesses must make a sound profit. We must experiment with new ideas. Research must be carried on, innovative programs developed, investments made for the future, and mistakes paid for. New equipment must be purchased, new facilities provided, and new products launched. Reserves must be created to provide for adverse times, and when we operate according to these principles, the stockholders should realize their fair share of return. So I think this is obviously from the top down. And for many, many years, Johnson & Johnson worked to fulfill this. In 1982, there was a huge crisis that occurred with Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson is the manufacturer of Tylenol. And a number of their products were tampered with, and as a result, people died. Somebody replaced Tylenol capsules with cyanide. They put cyanide in the capsules. People took it and they died. No one was ever brought to justice, but Tylenol and Johnson & Johnson recalled all of their products. They pulled every single product from the shelf at huge expense to them. Contrast that with the Ford Pinto case, for example, where Ford knew there was a problem with their Pinto, but because it was a cheap car and they figured that the average consumer of the car could just be paid off more readily than they could recall the entire product line and fix the problem. So they just chose to ignore it. The fact that if you were involved in an automobile accident in which you were rear-ended, you were likely to get the car blown up and kill you in the process. But they figured that it was cheaper. They did an actuarial study on this. It was just cheaper to pay people off than it was to recall the entire product line and fix the problem with the Ford Pinto. So I think it is one of those things where it can be top down, or you can also have examples where culture becomes organic and it comes from the bottom up. One of the things that we have experienced here, for example, at UCO, is that there's just been sort of a culture here that, this is a fairly pleasant place to work. And we don't pay as much as you could make at other places, but we provide a friendly environment for our professors where you're going to, likely get promoted, and it's not going to be all that onerous, and it's not going to necessarily be a petty competition. At lots of other schools, I just got promoted to full professor. This year, I got the notice in the mail the other day that I was being promoted. So the academic ranks among full-time faculty are instructor or lecturer, then you have assistant professor, associate professor, and then full professor. So if you're hired, if you have a terminal degree, you start out as an assistant professor. If you don't have a terminal degree and you're working on it, you start out as an instructor. After so many years, 5 years, you're eligible to apply for promotion and tenure, and you get that. And then after, I think, 5 more years, you're eligible to apply for full professor. So the sort of culture here was that if you did your job and you did it well, you didn't have much to worry about. Whereas at other schools, there's a far more subjective sort of attitude towards tenure and promotion. And for example, I don't think OU has promoted and tenured anybody in marketing in the past 7 years. And it may be longer than that. So what happens if you don't get promoted and you don't get tenure? Well, you leave, you're gone. And so there was a sort of culture here that's not the environment that we are in. And some people have tried to change that culture here. They tried to impose a much more rigid sort of standard for publishing in the college. And so that has not gone over terribly well. So culture can be both something that people try to impose. It's easier for a top-down approach to be imposed if a business is fairly new, because it doesn't have a long history. What's the problem with trying to change the culture here at UCO? And when I was associate general counsel, I saw this happen. It seems like we would hire somebody, a dean for a college from outside. They would be an unmitigated disaster. And then we would hire somebody who was from inside because they had to fix the problems that the deans from outside created. I remember, the first dean that they hired that was from outside was in the College of Liberal Arts in the amount of years that I've been here. And I followed that guy around with a bucket and a shovel to clean up the crap that he created, because he just came in and he didn't sort of understand what our culture was. And it's very difficult to have it sort of an imposed top-down approach to things in an institution that's been around for over 100 years. And this is sort of where we are. If I were to become dean, I always said, after watching several experiences where we hired people from outside, like you need to come in, and if you're hired as dean from an outside perspective, as an outsider, you need to figure out, like, spend a year figuring out where the bathroom is rather than trying to shake something up, because there's just sort of an ingrained deal here that is hard to shake, right? And that's been partially organic. Obviously, at the time that we were founded, it was easier probably to impose some kind of culture from the top down than it is once you have a business or an institution that has a long history. So looking at culture and marketing, internal structures. So when we talk about the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, opportunities and threats are things that impact you from externally, right? Those are things that you don't have lots of control over, but you have to respond to. The internal are the strengths and weaknesses. So culture, a lot of times, looks at and is dependent upon your strengths and weaknesses as an organization. What was, for example, our strength forever and ever and ever at UCO? Well, I think one of our strengths was that, historically speaking, we were an institution that you were going to get faculty members who were primarily focused on teaching as opposed to primarily focused on research. I will never forget my first class when I went to OU, my first year. I did everything wrong. They told us when I went to OU that we shouldn't live with our best friends because it will probably result in ruining your friendship. And we were all so tight. We had spent so much time at each other's houses that we thought, like, we're going to be the exception. And I will tell you that was absolutely wrong. Like, we hated each other by the end of the first year, and we all did something else. We went different places after that first year, because you don't really, spending the night at somebody's house is completely different than living with them day in and day out. Two of us, I was in this category, were enormously neat and clean freaks, and two of our suite mates were complete and utter slobs. I don't think they changed their sheets the entire time in that first year. You could just go in and, like, the odor, we lived in Walker Tower, so you have a room, a bathroom, and then a room. And the odor that emanated from their room was just absolutely disgusting. You could, like, grow culture mold, mold cultures in their room. So I went to OU with them. I had this horrible experience with living with these two people that were just not sort of what I thought they were going to be. And then to top that off, in my first class, on my first day at OU, it was Monday morning. It was American National Government, which everybody has to take. And I was a political science major, so I was very, interested in this class. And the professor walked to the front of the room. He's still there. I've seen him at when I used to be a political scientist at OPSA meetings and things like that. His name was Alan Hertzke. And he said, I'm going to tell you, since this is your first class of your first semester, I feel it necessary to indoctrinate you as to what the college experience is all about. And he said, have I told you all this story? No. Okay, good. I only have so many stories, so like sometimes I repeat them. So he walks to the front of the class and he says, "My name is Alan Hertzke. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Oklahoma. I have 7 years to publish 3 major articles and get a book deal and make associate professor and get tenure. After that, I have 7 years to do the same thing and become a full professor. At that point in time, I might care about teaching you, but until then, I don't really care." And if you think that the graduate assistants that are here, we met Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Monday and Wednesday, we met in this lecture hall, which had 350 people, which is more than I graduated with. And on Fridays, we met in breakout sessions with the various graduate assistants that were assigned. So they would be like, I don't know, 30 or 40 people in a breakout session and you were supposed to, like write papers and turn it into the graduate assistant and they would grade it in these breakout sessions. So he said, if you think that they're here to help you, they're not. They're all working on their PhDs and they're enormously busy and neurotic. And so, good luck. And with that, the class was over. And I thought, geez, God, like, what a way to welcome you. After that year, I came to UCO and that was a decision I never regretted because we have, professors who are terminally qualified in their degree program. We didn't have graduate assistants and, it was just a much more pleasant experience in terms of the quality of education that I get, that I felt that I got. Right. So that's my shameless plug for telling you all that you made a good decision, I think, in coming to UCO. Years later, when I wanted to get my PhD, I went to talk to OU, and this was the second bad experience I had. I went down there and I talked to the department chair, and she said, well, we'll admit you because John Kamey says that you're okay. But we noticed that you've been teaching a long time at UCO, and we certainly hope that you will not be going back to UCO because being a PhD is about research and teaching is something that one must endure in order to do research, right? Like you should shun teaching. And I thought, God, no, this is not what I want to do with my life. So again, I didn't go to OU for my PhD. I went to New Mexico State where they at least paid lip service to the idea that I could go wherever I wanted and they didn't really care. So I got my PhD at New Mexico State, and they were true to that, although they were surprised when I decided to come back to UCO. But I'm like, I have a teacher's retirement that's vested here in Oklahoma. So that's part of the culture, right? That's different at OU than it is here at UCO, where our primary focus is largely on providing quality education. We have to do research in order to maintain and keep up in the field, but it's definitely a difference, right? So corporate culture is a set of beliefs, expectations, the symbols and meaning that we attach to those symbols, and core values that we have as an organization. In Built to Last, Successful Habits of Visionary Companies, Parias and Collins talk about this idea. The most successful companies have a core set of values. Now, it turns out those values don't have to be good values. Philip Morris is one of the companies that they highlight. Philip Morris manufactures cigarettes. And they describe the CEO of Philip Morris as being cold, ruthless, and calculating, and saying things like, I see nothing wrong with selling a product that people don't need. Well, there are lots of products that people don't need that are not harmful to them. You don't need a Rolex, but it's not harmful to you to own one, right? I thought my life would not be complete until I got a Rolex. So I browbeat my parents until they got one for me for high school graduation. Right? I like watches. You don't need that. And when I first got it, I was like, you want to know what time it is? You don't need a Rolex, but it's not harmful to you. I guess, unless of course you're swimming in the Bahamas. We went to the Bahamas for vacation one year, right after I got my Rolex. And we went out on this catamaran to dive. It was a dive trip. And the operators of the boat were like, okay, we're going to take all your jewelry and you're going to put it in this little black bag here because this area is known for barracuda and the barracuda will strike. And so I'm about to get in the water and they're like, you want to put your watch in the bag, man? I'm like, no, I'm not giving you my Rolex. No, not taking it off. I'm like, it's a dive watch. You know, it's what it's made for, diving. And they're like, the barracuda will strike. And I'm like, the Barracuda are gonna have to fight me for the watch. So I'm getting in and I'm like noticing that they're like, okay, we're gonna be here for about an hour and a half and then you'll come back and we'll go to the next site. And I'm like, did you do a head count? And they're like, head count? No, we blow a horn, man, when it's time to come back. And I'm like, we're diving. And they're like, oh, you got your Rolex on. You don't know what time it is. Come back in an hour and a half. I'm like, craziness. And apparently there are lots of people that are actually left out there, on these trips. They just forget about them. You're left out there with the sharks. So, I mean, Philip Morris says you don't need cigarettes. Well, it's not just that you don't need them. You don't need the Rolex. It's actually harmful to you. So you don't have to have good values in order to be successful. You just have to have a core set of values. Now, what we would hope in an ethics course, what we're trying to strive for is that the values that you promote are good values. That they are focused on things like your customer, things like Johnson & Johnson's credo, that our first responsibility is to these people that we serve, that we have the opportunity and luxury of serving. Theodore Levitt, in a seminal work called Marketing Myopia, talks about this. One of the things that you can get into is if you focus too narrowly on this, you can lose sight of what it is. If you went back to the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of the largest companies in the United States were railroad companies. Why were they railroad companies? Because that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and railroads were one of the ways that you provided mass transportation. Are railroad companies today still some of the biggest companies? Well, some of them are, but for the most part, the companies that have become, multi-trillion-dollar companies are ones that focus on things like the internet and service providers, right? That's the real value in the economy. And what Levitt says is that railroad companies, a lot of them went out of business because they were focused on being a railroad company when they didn't realize that what they should be focused on is being a transportation company rather than being a railroad company. You're just myopic. You don't see the forest for the trees. So coming up with the corporate culture that is broad enough to allow you to be flexible is important. How do we instill this and how do we make sure that it is ethical? How many of you like The Office? A couple of you like The Office. Do you remember the ethics training episode of The Office?
Second episode.
My nephew, I cannot figure this out. He is now 13, but he started watching The Office when he was like 9. And I don't know why he likes it's not humor that most 9-year-olds would get because it's not over the top. It's sort of more nuanced in many instances than sort of slapstick, bathroom humor. But he loved The Office. And we're watching this, I hated The Office. I was forced to watch it with him, but watching the corporate training video, and they're talking in there with let's go back with the employees in the conference room, and basically Holly, who's doing the training, is really just sort of reading the list of rules and talking about, time theft and stuff like that. And one of the employees says, that's not ethics. Ethics is a discussion of the good. It's a discussion of values. What you're talking about are, corporate anti-theft policies. And obviously, the way we have our culture impacts whether or not you have corporate theft, whether or not people feel some affinity towards the institution, or whether they engage in one of the examples that they give in that episode that I like is the idea of time theft. If you are spending your time at work doing something other than your job, is that the same thing as stealing? I guess, you know. The problem is, can you focus for that length of time? The average person really can't focus for more than, about 75 minutes on any given task before they start to lose, which is one of the reasons why historically, actually, we had most classes were Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And most students in the past preferred Monday, Wednesday, and Friday because they were 50-minute classes. And it's a hell of a lot easier to tolerate something for 50 minutes than it is for 75. Now, most of you want, Tuesday, Thursday classes because, it's easier to get those in and still work 3 days a week, going early or whatever. But, historically, can you actually work for that length of time? No. We start to lose you, we know, after, about 50 minutes, and by 75, that's about all you can really take, right? So training becomes important. In this episode of The Office, she's basically just reading the rules so that she can get through it and get her, signature on the idea that the employees have been trained. So what should training include? This is one of those things where I was fascinated when I went into marketing. My background was not in business. I had gone to work in the corporate world, but I was a lawyer. And so, I was more focused on sort of legal issues. And I went into the marketing department at New Mexico State. And at that time, one of the foremost scholars in marketing ethics was actually at the University of New Mexico. And he was friends with my mentor, who was my dissertation chair, whose name was Michael Hyman. And the guy who was at New Mexico State, he and his wife have written a lot about ethics and marketing. And his name was O.C. Farrell, and his wife was Linda Farrell. And they came and they gave a lecture on ethics. And one of the things that they talked about was they were not philosophers, and they didn't focus on training. And then he proceeded to talk about how Kant's categorical imperative was the golden rule. And I literally am hitting my head on the table. And my dissertation chair is, because they brought them down, we had this initiative called the Daniels Initiative in Ethics. And I'm hitting my dissertation chair is poking me going, don't do it. Don't do it. PhD programs are not fair. And the department head loves these people. Kant's categorical imperative is not the golden rule, right? It's not the golden rule. What's the golden rule? Well, the golden rule is stated positively, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's not Kant's categorical imperative. It's not, just not. That's just wrong. It's a priori wrong. What's wrong with the golden rule?
It's driven by desire versus Kant's isn't. It's regardless of desire.
Okay, so I may want things done to me that you don't want done to you, right? I could be, a masochist who enjoys having pain inflicted on me. And you may not want that. The golden rule doesn't always work, because I may do things to you that, I want done to me that you don't want done to you. I think I may be slightly a masochist. I went through both a JD program and a PhD program. That's a lot of torture. That's a lot of pain inflicted on myself that now ultimately it was for, good cause. I became a lawyer, and that there's some merit to that. I became a PhD, and that, I have a good job. I get to come down here and talk at you all one day a week and, make 6 figures. It's nice.
Wow.
I encourage you to do this.
I encourage you to do it.
I really do. I think if you want a really nice job, I have tried to talk. I have written letters of recommendation for 26 of my students that I know have gone on to law school and passed the bar. I tried to talk every single one of them out of that decision. And to a number, all of them have come back and said, I really wish I hadn't done this, right? Because it's kind of an unpleasant way of making a living. I have attempted to try and talk people into getting PhDs, and so far I've got 3. but I've managed to talk into it. I think you should seriously consider, this is a nice life. You know, if you have kids, which I don't, but if you do, you get the same sort of schedule as your kids. You're off when they're off, you know, you have a nice life. So, yeah, there is this idea that Will and O.C. Farrell had, which is that in training, you just need to focus on sort of the nuts and bolts of it. And what I would argue is that in this training, you need to think about why it is that we have the rules that we have. And that's what this course is designed to do, is to make you think critically about the rules. Why is it that we have a rule? What is the underlying purpose of the rule? Let's take something basic that we can all sort of understand. You know, capital murder, murder in the first degree, the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. If we didn't have that prohibition, we couldn't have a functioning society. If we go back to Hobbes's Leviathan, Hobbes imagines a state of nature in which we have no government, we have no rules, and he says it's a war of all against all. I used to, as a younger person, I used to think, I don't know rules. You know, I know what the rules should be. I should be able to make the rules, right? That's what the state of nature is. Hobbes says that this is, in this state of nature, which we know did exist at one point in time, that life is solitary, nasty, poor, and brutish. How many of you all watch like the Discovery Channel and Animal Planet and things like that? I love this. I love particularly specials on sub-Saharan Africa. I want to go on a safari. It's one of the few things I haven't done in my life that I really want to do, is go on an African safari. I have a friend who was an engineer in Kenya, and he said if there is a heaven on earth, it's in Kenya, right? And I like the specials particularly about lions. I think they're just absolutely fascinating. Lions are the only feline species that live in groups. Almost every other feline is solitary. It's the one exception to you have to have two. If you have a dog, you probably ought to have another dog, because they are social creatures. I have prairie dogs. They're social, they live in colonies, in coteries, and you have to have more than one. Otherwise they become depressed. Horses live in groups. Lions are the only feline. Almost every other feline species is solitary. That's why if you have two cats, they don't get along, because they're solitary for the most part. So lions live in these prides, and it's good to be the male lion. You have this pride, right? That's what they call a group of lions, is a pride. And who does all the work? Does the male lion do? No. The female lionesses like do all the hunting, and the male lion eats what he wants, and sort of walks around and struts his stuff. That's what the state of nature is like, because what happens when the male lion, it's good to be the male lion of a pride until you get to be old. And at that point in time, you will be challenged, and someone will take the pride away from you. And when they do, they will kill all of your offspring. That's what the state of nature is like. And so we come up with these rules, and it's not just enough that we train on the rules and we talk about, don't engage in time theft. It's understanding more than the state of nature, understanding fundamentally why we have this prohibition, for example, against the indiscriminate killing of another human being with malice aforethought. What's behind that rule? Fundamentally, it's about the fact that in order to have a society that functions, you can't allow for the indiscriminate killing of other people. That one's basic. We can all get that. Now, more, areas of gray. Is it ever okay to lie in business? We talked about Pretty Woman and the idea that Richard Gere lies to this guy, says your contracts are dead. Is that okay? How do we create this ethical climate? And what should the training focus on? It can't just be about the rules. And it also has to be about leaders that walk the walk and talk the talk. That they embody the values that they have. It also is about the empowerment of employees. Johnson & Johnson's credo, our employees must be safe and secure to make complaints and have those complaints investigated, right? It's established by, and one of the reasons why I really like virtue ethics is because these are the ways that we engage our lives. It's through habituation. It's through habits and character. And so I think training programs should focus on understanding fundamentally what these types of philosophies are and how they impact our culture. What constitutes ethical leadership? Good leadership versus ethical leadership. What is good leadership? Good leadership is leaders that are effective in accomplishing their goals. The definition of leadership is the ability to get other people to do things that you want done. And I had this huge debate with one of the professors. One of the things that we were debating was our mission statement in the college. And they really put a heavy focus on leadership. And I said, let's think about this. Not everybody wants to be a leader. I sort of like it. I mean, I've run for public office. I've been vice mayor in Guthrie. I like being in positions of power. I like being a college professor, mostly so I can crush your little hopes and dreams. Not really, right? I used to go around the class and say, what year are you? And I'm a graduating senior. Oh, well, maybe I can solve that for you. Maybe I can end that little down. I don't. I genuinely like, students. An effective or a good leader is one that can get people to do. It's not necessarily an ethical leader. You can get people to do things and you can lead them astray. The ultimate example of this is Nazi Germany. Hitler was a very effective leader until he wasn't. But that's not an ethical leader. So what types of leadership are there? Well, there's contingency theory, theory X and theory Y. So theory X says that people are inherently sort of lazy and they have to be prodded in order to do their jobs. You have to use carrots and sticks, and mostly you have to use sticks. Employees will slack off if they can. Theory Y, on the other hand, posits that people are inherently sort of self-motivated and they want to do things. They find value in their jobs. One of the things I always say, and I always tell students, is that what's the first question people are going to ask you when they first meet you? It's what do you do? And it's not because they care about you or they're interested in you. It's an icebreaker, and it also allows them to peg you on the social ladder. Where are you? When I say I'm an attorney, by the way, my mother does this. I tell people, if they ask me, what do you do? I say I'm a college professor. My mother always tells people, this is my son, the lawyer. She's got two sons that are lawyers. She's very proud of that she's got two attorneys. And I'm like, I'm a college professor. I mean, literally, what I do every day is I'm a college professor. Yes, I still practice law. I still have a boutique practice, but my mother's like, she's just, because lawyer, I guess, sounds better. When I became a teacher, my mother had been a teacher. And she quit teaching very early on because she wanted to make a lot of money. And so when I became a teacher, my mother said, Grant, those who can do and those who can't teach. That was her attitude towards being a college professor. Now, I think she appreciates it more now that she's 73 years old and I have all this time that I can help her with her business because I'm not, engaged in going to court every single day and being completely neurotic. But she tells everybody I'm a lawyer because that sounds like, more panache, I guess, to her. And we find a goodly amount of our identities are wrapped up in what we do. And so what I would say is that with regard to Theory X and Theory Y, it sort of depends on the kind of organization you have. If you are, for example, a waste management company like Laidlaw, who, I don't think that there's, I don't think that most garbage truck drivers find a great deal of joy in their job. It's simply a means to an end. It's how they make a living. Now, there are days when I have to read. I will hopefully get to your essays, this week. I've got other classes that have turned lots of stuff in and I'm kind of behind on grading. But, when I have to read the essays, a lot of times, the first round particularly, I want to stab myself in the eye to deal with the pain that, I had a student write, I think I told you all this. I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham, bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a tumbling routine. And like literally after I went to the bathroom and threw up, I wrote, I leapt like a gazelle to the conclusion you deserve an F, for making me read this drivel. And I thought, at that point, garbage truck drivers make about $20,000, $25,000 a year. Boy, that sounds really nice. I don't have to read this. And it's not a bad job anymore. They drive around and the little arm picks up the trash and puts it back. I just ride around all day. That doesn't sound like a terribly bad idea. But I don't think anybody, sort of yearns to be a trash collector. It's just sort of what you have to do. And if you have that kind of workforce, maybe Theory X is more applicable. Whereas if you're dealing with, college professor, where a lot of what I do is really dependent upon what I have in my head and my ability to communicate that effectively to you, you're going to have to, you can't sort of use carrots and sticks because, it just doesn't work that way. A lot of what I do is really dependent upon the quality of the education I provide on what is in my head. And I could probably, by objective measures, get away with doing a lot less. I mean, education is one of the things where the less you get, the happier you are. If I cancel class, students are just always ecstatic about that. If I talked less about this stuff, but I have to, I'm intrinsically motivated. And so the job requires, I think, sort of a theory that people do their job because they want to do well and they find pleasure in what they're doing. You can have dialogic, which is employee-centered leadership, where you focus on your employees and want what's best for them. How do we do that? Well, it's in terms of the benefits and things like that we provide, the workplace environment that we provide our employees. Charismatic leadership, now these two are closely related, charismatic and transformational. Charismatic leadership is generally viewed negatively. Charismatic leaders are people who are able to motivate people because they have charm, but in many instances, that charm can be negatively directed. Transformational, on the other hand, are people who motivate, but they want their employees to be better. They want inherently for their employees to do well. This is one of the ones that I think we should think about seriously as models, particularly in the kinds of organizations that you are going to go into where you're going to have an enormous amount of discretion in how you do your job. If you're going to be, for example, a sales major and you're going into professional selling, you're probably not going to have a boss that stands over you. all the time because that's not the way sales occurs. It's going to be dependent upon whether or not you can get up and motivate yourself to go out and do these things, which is, one of the reasons it's not necessarily a career for everyone. I tell students, like if you are one of these people that wants to be alone and sit there and do double entry bookkeeping, may God help you and have mercy on your immortal soul. Sales is probably not for you. If you're just interested in, like collecting a paycheck and doing your job, probably, go into accounting. I don't know how you stay awake long enough to get that degree, but, go into accounting. Paternalistic leadership. This is one where the leader feels like they're, sort of the father figure. Again, with many of the careers that you'll have, it doesn't work terribly well because you're not necessarily going to have somebody standing over you. Did you brush your teeth today? Things like that. Pragmatic leadership oftentimes occurs when you have a leader that's thrust into the position unexpectedly. This happens a lot in businesses where people are promoted up through the ranks and they achieve, it's called the Peter Principle. They achieve, their level, they're promoted to their level of incompetence. Lots of people who are good employees don't necessarily make great leaders. And oftentimes they engage in pragmatic leadership because it's just sort of incremental leadership. Just, look at what we did in the past and we're going to do what we did. We're going to continue doing what we did in the past to incrementally sort of improve. And then you have caring leadership, which the leader, is involved in their subordinates' lives and they care about the person. I think we should really think about transformational leadership. So how do we build this culture of ethical leaders? Well, it starts with our mission statement. Looking at the mission statement of the company. Looking at Johnson & Johnson's credo, right? What is it all about? It's about servicing their clients' and customers' needs, and the doctors and nurses and the people who provide patient care. It's also found in our codes of ethics. I generally think that these codes of ethics need to be less specific than they oftentimes are. If you look at codes of ethics, for example, for the bar, for lawyers, it's a very thick tome and it's got a lot of very specific stuff. And then there are commentaries on the code, right? They give you examples in the code. Why is that? Well, for lawyers, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have this sort of very unique relationship with our client where we can do a lot of harm to our client. How many of you watched the Murdaugh trial? Some, a little bit. His lawyers let him take the stand. I think that was a bad idea. I think they should have seriously counseled him out of that because I don't think he did himself any favors. They basically got him to admit on the stand that he was a liar, that he lied about almost everything, that he stole clients' funds, that he was addicted to opioids. So the code of legal ethics is enormously complex. It's very technical. And I think one of the things that we should think about is having sort of not just a code that has all these details, but one that provides broad outlines of what it is that we value and why. Because there's going to be, no matter how detailed your code, there are going to be times where things fall outside that code, right? And are not covered by lots of specific details. So I think you should think about broad contours of, honesty, integrity, things like that. How do we monitor these things? Well, we can have ethics hotlines where people are, able to make and lodge complaints and they feel secure and protected. Now, this is one of the things that is sort of controversial because if you have these hotlines and you allow people to make anonymous complaints, how do you investigate? Generally speaking, one of the things that we do in this country is we have this idea of due process. And there's two sort of forms of due process. There's procedural due process, and then there is substantive due process. What is procedural due process? That's the idea, so PDP, that what we need to have is we need to have sort of, we need to have rules in place that allow for people to feel that they're being treated fairly. What's the heartland of procedural due process? Well, it's notice and hearing. Now, the more damage you get, the more hearing you should be afforded. The heartland of it is notice and hearing. Being confronted with the accusation against you. Now, generally speaking, what does this mean? Well, in a full-blown criminal trial, it means the right to confront your accuser, the right of confrontation. Should we have that in the private sector, for example? Should you have the right to, know which of your employees said, horrible things about you? This is one of those things where I have a lot of heartburn with people being able to make accusations that may be completely unfounded and having somebody respond and not being able to confront their accuser. However, one of the things that we have to be sensitive to is that a lot of people don't feel comfortable, coming forward. But if you're going to take people's livelihoods away, maybe you need to think about that and how you can go about that. Having the corporate ethics officer who actually has a seat at the table. Is the ethics officer just somebody that reports to somebody who's, in the boardroom, as opposed to having somebody who's actually in the boardroom that can assess and make judgments about things that you're doing. And then finally, having this sort of holistic integration of things. And this is, again, where I think one of the things that we should think about is virtue ethics, because virtue ethics is the holistic approach to ensuring that we have sort of ethically sensitive culture. All right, so I will try and get the test graded as quickly as I possibly can. If you feel cheated because I got through this faster than I thought I would, you let me know and I will be happy to keep you late next Tuesday.